Hello everyone, welcome back to episode 4 of AAPI History. Today we'll be talking about the history of Asians in the US military and their impacts during times of war. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th in 1941 in an attempt to undermine the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Over 2,200 sailors were killed and many warships were destroyed. The desire to win a decisive strike against the U.S. prompted America to declare war on Japan and eventually join World War II against them and the Axis powers. The attacks on Pearl Harbor didn't mean just war with Japan, it meant war on the Japanese people as well. Unfortunately, this meant the 120,000 Japanese people living in the U.S. as well, in which over two-thirds were born and raised U.S. citizens. After the attacks, the United States saw a wave of xenophobia against the Japanese because they were seen as a threat to U.S. national security, and almost all people of Japanese descent were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to live in internment camps. Xenophobia upon AAPI people were only heightened, and especially the Japanese were affected. Fear and prejudice was instilled in the American people, and thus Japanese Americans were sent to live in internment camps and were forced out of their homes to do so. Order 9906 was signed by Franklin Roosevelt following the Pearl Harbor attacks. This order affected over 100,000 Japanese Americans. They lived in uninsulated barracks, furnished with only cots and coal-burning stoves, which only fosters tension, suspicion, and despair. It would not be for another 4 more years that these people would see freedom. You may have seen posters urging for Japanese people to leave the U.S., along with acts of violence. For people immigrating to a country that prides itself on being the land of the free, they were only met with racism and discrimination. The U.S. War Department was ordered to relocate these Japanese Americans in internment camps. These camps had army barracks that provided little to no protections against the heat or the cold, and when they were not working, they were restricted by barbed wire and armed guards. It is estimated by the end of the war that they lost over $400 million in property, and Congress approved $38 million in 1948 as reparations, and 40 years later, $20,000 to the remaining survivors. Although the Japanese were mistreated, in the U.S. there was actually an all-American Japanese combat unit who fought for the U.S. during World War II. They were volunteers and they formed the Japanese-American 442nd Infantry Regiment. The 442nd Infantry Regiment served in the European theater, and some engagements they fought in were the Rhineland, the Allied invasion of Sicily, Central Europe, and more. They most famously rescued the Lost Battalion, who were cut off by Germans. During the attempt, they suffered over 800 casualties, and to this day, they are considered the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the U.S. military because of their brave and valiant feats. Some awards include over 8,000 Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars, 8 Presidential Unit Citations, and 21 Medals of Honors, the most prestigious decoration a soldier can have. Currently, some members of the 442nd are still alive and continue to carry on the legacy through traditions and honors, in which they were one of the last units allowed their shoulder insignias. The attack on Pearl Harbor were not the only offensive launched by the Japanese. On the other side of the international date line, Japan launched an offensive on multiple islands, including the Philippines, a U.S. Commonwealth state. This meant that the Filipinos were U.S. nationals, and subsequently, Roosevelt pledged to defend them. The U.S. placed Filipino military under the control of General Douglas MacArthur. After Japan took up all of Southeast Asia and a majority of the Philippines, the Allied forces held out for a few months on the Bataan Peninsula, but they were forced to surrender and over 76,000 were captured. The Japanese led the POWs on a 60-mile walk and over 10,000 Filipino died. This was known as the Bataan Death March. The Philippines were surrendered in 1942, but over 250,000 kept fighting a guerrilla war against the invaders. In 1943, Roosevelt pledged the Filipinos independence after the war was over, and on July 4th of 1946, the Philippines raised their own flag instead of a U.S. flag. Roosevelt pledged that any Filipino who fought for the U.S. would receive veteran benefits, but Roosevelt passed the Recession Act, which retroactively annulled benefits for Filipino veterans and their widows, because it was deemed too expensive. Instead, they opted to pay $200 million to the Philippine government to disperse among themselves. 70 years later, the veterans had still not received benefits from the government until 2009, when the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act paid a lump sum of $15,000 to Filipino veterans who were U.S. citizens and $9,000 to non-citizens. 19,000 claims were approved, but over 24,000 had been declined because their name was not on a list of 260,000 guerrilla fighters. The remaining veterans in 2017 received a Congressional Gold Medal, but many still are without pay. API men weren't the only ones affected and involved in the war, though. World War II saw a shift, and avenues being opened up for women, and AAPI women were no exceptions. The roles ranged from being pilots, translators, factory workers, and guerrilla fighters. One critical role they played were Nisei Linguists. Nisei Linguists were children of Japanese descent, recruited top secretly by the U.S. Army as translators, translating Japanese documents, interrogations, and etc. They were crucial to the war effort in the Pacific Theater, directly responsible for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, from which the Japanese never recovered, and the Battle of Saipan. It is estimated that they translated over 20.5 million pages of the classified information due to their top secret nature. Combined with Executive Order 9066, they don't often get enough credit for their heroism. Now, World War II eventually came to an end in 1945, and one of the main reasons were the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And aside from the potential questions about its ethicality, few are aware of how the atomic bomb was developed. The atomic bomb wasn't created or perfected overnight. The process was one of testing, and if you're asking yourself how do you test an atomic bomb, radiation, etc. safely in the 1940s, the answer is you don't. And instead, you deem which life gets priority. Originally, the tests were going to be in New Mexico, but after the questions about its safety were raised, the tests moved to the Marsha Islands. The Marsha Islands are home to over nearly 58,000 Pacific Islanders. Despite pleas not to, over 66 U.S. nuclear tests have been conducted there, and those exposed becoming subjects of medical experiments. 4 of the islands making up the Marsha Islands were vaporized by the tests, and as in their sovereign land didn't exist anymore. And even today, radiation poisoning, birth defects, cancer, and leukemia rates are all very high there. So over 1/3 of the country has left secret refuge in the US. Whether or not they've been successful is another story. History is a story, but it's never an isolated one. Instead, it's intertwined. Actions half a century ago informing actions taken today and actions taken tomorrow. Too many times we expect that ending a certain action ends the ramification of that action, that the violence and harm it caused will disappear too, but this isn't a reality that we can all live in. People have to deal with the legacies and events of the past. Anything else assumes that history is just isolated events. For example, when you examine immigration from Central America, the Middle East, or the Marshall Islands, wonder what happened to cause it, these events aren't isolated incidents, and the rest of history isn't either. All stories are woven together, and all history is cut from that same cloth. The question is, if we learn from history, can we move that needle forward? Thank you for watching, and we will catch you all next time.